housing. Third theme is transport, and the fourth theme is devolution and local government. And we're going to try and organise it into three parts, the session. So the first one is about the manifesto headlines. What are they saying on each of those themes? And also how prominent those themes are in the manifestos more generally. The second thing then is obviously a reflection on the proposals, particularly given what we know about the situation on those themes in different parts of the country. Are the proposals broadly right? Are they broadly wrong? And what's particularly missing? And then the third section, as we get towards the end, will actually be about turning those manifestos into a programme for the next government. So you'll say a little bit about what we expect or what we would want to see from the next government in terms of those four themes. I've got three colleagues joining me, as you can see, sitting alongside me to go through the detail of all of this. So I've got Anthony Breach, Caitlin Rollison, and James Evans. So, and before we get into hearing from James on economic growth, innovation and investment, as always, if you've got questions or comments of us or your own reflections on your own reading of the manifestos, I'm sure you've done it, then put it in the Q&A and we'll have a conversation about that. I'll feed that in as we go along. So that's how we're going to do the next 55 minutes or so. So let's start with economic growth, innovation and investment. James, how prominent was it and what were some of the big headlines?
Well, I mean, growth is a really big theme of this election. We've had 14 years where growth and productivity has been really slow, and the parties are at least nominally getting into a position where they want to be addressing it. So I'd say it's made a fairly prominent all in all, and it's worth saying that all three major parties are interested in tinkering at least with parts of the sorts of levers that we're going to be interested in as we go into the election. Now, from a sort of urban policy perspective, some of it's spatial, some of it's not. On the Conservative side, they're mostly interested in working with existing structures. Again, some of them are spatial, some of them not, but some of the biggies are the investment zones, the innovation catapults, and some of them they're calling large-scale compute clusters, which are apparently something to do with AI, but we're not actually sure what that really is.
Does anybody know what they are?
I don't think anybody really knows what that is. There's some more cash as well. So current public R&D is running at about £20 billion, and the Conservatives are talking about upping it by around 10%. Now, on the Labour and the Liberal Democrat side, we see a desire, they want to do industrial strategy again, basically, to cut a long story short. And Labour have talked a little bit about devolved growth plans fitting into this sort of wider industrial strategy when it does appear. Of those two major national parties that are talking about industrial strategy, it's only really Labour who are willing to put up the cash to pay for some of it. So the headline figure is about 7.3 billion, which is going to go on things like gigafactories, the battery plants, hydrogen, carbon capture, some investment in ports. The real big one is steel. £2.5 billion is going to go on what they are calling clean steel. What that looks like, I'm not entirely sure. It's worth saying that Labour think that this will crowd in with the bits of investment. They think there's going to be £3 of private investment for every pound that they put in. And the other thing to say about the Labour plans, but also the Conservatives as well, is that a lot of this stuff is being tied into their green ambitions. So on the Conservative side, that looks like things like small modular reactors, green industries accelerator, and an interesting line about investing in offshore wind in the most deprived communities, which I think is something actually we'll touch on later. On the Labour side, it's very much in the now watered down green stuff, where they still hope there was a bit less money. They're going to deliver about 650,000 jobs. So I think that's broadly where they're at, and that's how I think the economy is going to move on.
Great, excellent. So as you said, we'll come back to that. It seems to be on the growth side particularly, and as you said, on investment. The green aspects, the green transition is doing quite a lot of the heavy lifting. As we know, there's particular geographies to that, which would be interesting to explore in a bit more detail as we get into our own reflections. And let's do theme 2, which is housing. Very prominent, very big vibe on, in different ways. Just say a little bit about where we are on housing.
Yeah, sure thing. So I think I'd say that it's certainly prominent in the public debate around the election for sure. I think in some ways it's not quite as prominent as you might think in the manifestos itself, and often for quite similar reasons. So it's one of several dozen different distinct issues within both the Conservative and the Lib Dem manifesto, so along with things like crime, along with health, along with economic growth, etc. Whereas Labour sort of seemed to conceive of it more in the kind of 5 missions approach. So housing comes under the economic mission that they're setting out. I think it perhaps makes a little bit more sense to talk about housing in that way, rather than trying to talk about it as a sort of a discrete kind of policy issue, which needs to be fixed for its own sake. But it's also not quite as prominent in Labour's manifesto in the same way that, say, Starmer and Reeves often talk about planning. We had Starmer, I think, at the weekend saying he was happy to make enemies to get more stuff built. We weren't quite seeing that. You're not seeing anything near as spicy in the manifesto itself. I think it's also quite clear that the targets themselves aren't necessarily that ambitious. So, while Labour's promising 1.5 million houses over 5 years, which is the same as the current government's target of 300,000 every year for 5 years, the Tories are promising 1.6 million over 5 years. So both quite a bit behind that 4.3 million we know is missing from the UK's national housing market. I think across both, I think sort of the thinking that seems to be going into it is in the manifestos itself is a bit more like, we know this problem is really bad. Here's some bits about how we think we'll try and make it a bit better, rather than here's how housing is going to be our solution to a number of other distinct policy and economic problems. I think one downstream consequence of that is there isn't a huge amount on building in the most unaffordable places, especially in the most expensive cities. I think also there's a little bit of coyness in all the manifestos, where they kind of admit that the planning system is really restricting house building, restricting growth. They don't go quite all the way and say, well, perhaps we should have a different kind of planning system that would be better, even if they also do suggest some changes they would make to the planning system.
Yeah, that'll be in it. We'll come back onto that when we think about our own reflections, the extent to which we think that getting close to those numbers, which we haven't done recently, can be done through the existing system with some tweaks around the edges versus beginning to think about quite a different system. So we can definitely come back to that as well. Caitlin, let's do our third theme, which is transport. What did the manifestos say on that? How prominent was it?
Yeah, so I'm going to pick up on just 2 aspects of transport that are most relevant to Britain, and that is buses and cars. And I think obviously these are issues that are not as, say, heavy hitters or as spicy as growth or as housing, but they are still fairly prominent. I think this is quite noticeable given how much of a local policy issue they've been. All 3 of the parties spend roughly the same amount of time talking about buses. And I think that's a recognition of how much they do matter to people. And that's something that we saw when we did polling ahead of the mayoral elections back in early May. When you get into what the focus is, that's when they start to differ a bit. So the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats have a little bit more focus on rural areas, expanding routes, including some of the specifics about where that would happen. That's pretty consistent, obviously, with the focus in the rest of their manifestos. Whereas when it comes to Labour, it's much more of an overall approach. And again, that's consistent with their manifestos. They focus on allowing everywhere that wants to franchise the buses, ending the ban on municipal ownership of bus companies, and integrating networks. And the end of the, sorry, not the municipal ownership. So the introduction of franchising for everywhere that wants it was originally part of their Take Back Control Act. But I think it's important to note this has actually now been moved to their Better Buses bill. And that means that there's no timeline on when this might happen. And then just quickly to note on rail, again, it's the same approach for Labour. They would enable a little bit more local control of stations for mayors. And then another thing to note on buses is that both the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats commit to continuing the £2 bus fare cap. And there's nothing on this from Labour. And then just quickly touching on cars and motoring. Here, again, you have roughly the same amount of content from all 3 parties, about 3 paragraphs in the Labour manifesto, 2 in the Conservative. But when it comes to the content, somewhat unsurprisingly, you have a much clearer cut difference in what they're actually saying. So the Conservatives have a very strong, unsurprisingly, rhetoric on road pricing and ending the war on motorists. So they are proposing to ban pay-per-mile road pricing, and that extends to preventing local places, local mayors from implementing that if they want to. They would also reverse the ULEZ rise, and they would rule out or make low traffic neighbourhoods and 20-mile-an-hour zones case-by-case decisions. Again, there's a notable absence on anything related to that from Labour. most of what they talk about is in relation to potholes and to EVs.
Yeah, it's an interesting, as you say, the issues around the I can't believe you said the buses weren't spicy or exciting.
Sorry.
Terrible commentary from a set of cities member of the team, but quite it's interesting around the bus comment, but actually quite a distinct difference, not only on the car front, which we'll definitely come back to, not least because the national government, if it's a Conservative government, wants to stop places from doing the things that they may deem to be appropriate or not, which is a broader issue we should probably touch on. Let's do theme 4, which is devolution and local government, and you're going to pick up on that again, prominence and then headlines.
Yeah, sure thing. So I say that devolution isn't really a huge part of either manifesto. Again, it's part of that shopping list for the Tories. It's one of the things that they touch on in their quite long series of issues. Whereas for Labour, it's again folded into that economic mission for Labour. One thing I've noticed is it's quite interesting that the Tories frame it much more around levelling up and kind of continuing that strategy, continuing that rhetoric, sort of absent in other parts of the manifesto, while that phrase doesn't appear once in the Labour manifesto. So there's arguably, well, there has been this rhetorically a big break between the Conservatives and Labour on devolution. Nevertheless, I'd still say there's probably still a consensus on devolution, on the big questions facing the next government, in that now we're in this position where about 50% of England now has a mayoral devolution deal. You see this tension we've been discussing for a while at Centre for Cities between deepening powers for existing mayoralties and widening out devolution to places that currently don't have it. Both manifestos commit to both more deepening and more widening, which I think understandable given the politics, but I think is significant in the fact that there's definitely a world in which both manifestos, or either manifesto, says we've done enough devolution in the big cities now. Now it's time to focus exclusively on other areas. So I think there's going to be a commitment, however the election goes, towards more powers for the big metro areas. But there's not really much about what that might look like, I think, in either manifesto. So partly because the current process is so voluntary, I think it's hard for either manifesto to kind of set out clearly exactly what they want from a new process. I mean, the other issue that I think was on my mind reading the manifestos is local finance, right? So obviously councils are under huge financial pressure at the minute. It doesn't really appear in either manifesto, which is a bit disappointing. Both of them are promising more multi-year settlements, which is welcome. But most of the focus and discussion around local finance in the manifestos is about bills for households, which makes sense. But I think, again, is a little bit disappointing. I think maybe a bit more recognition of some of these huge systemic factors, that the next government's going to have to grapple with. I think would have been welcome. Yeah,
and we'll come back to this when we get on to our reflections this morning. Labour coming out and being very explicit that they won't do anything on council tax, for example, even though everyone, probably including themselves, recognises the council tax is increasingly daft as a policy, as the technical term for it, and definitely could do with reform, but maybe it's one of those policies where everybody agrees it needs to be done, but nevertheless we won't get to do it, but we can come back to that as well. And I think your interesting point about talking about multi-year funding settlements, but no real commentary around the extent to which there is going to be more money in the system, and if that is the case, then more local authorities going bankrupt over the next parliament is almost a given, right?
Yes.
So we can come back to that, which will have political implications, not just service delivery and economic implications as well. So that's a quick sort of canter through on those 4 themes, the manifestos and what they've broadly been saying. Obviously, loads more detail in each of the manifestos to varying degrees. So let's kind of go around again. Start with you, James. Start now to unpack the manifestos and get some reflection on good, bad, indifferent in terms of some of the ideas that have been proposed. Again, obviously we can only do headlines. And by the way, if you've got questions or comments based on your own reflections or what's already been said, then put them in the Q&A and I'll feed them into to colleagues as we go through. We've got a couple of questions, but we can always do with some more. James, pick up the growth, innovation, investment, our own reflections given what we know about the state of these issues across the country.
Well, I think the big one from our perspective is that actually across all the manifestos, all the interventions are not very urban. All of the interest is not on huge urban issues, which for us, I mean, we've been banging the drum for a very long time. We did it most recently in the G7 report, which is Britain's underperformance lies in its big cities, particularly outside of London and the Greater South East. None of the major parties seem particularly interested in arresting that problem, or at least not interested enough from our perspective. And you see this partly in the green stuff, and then the knock-ons in relation to things like advanced manufacturing, etc. So one of the big things is they're focused on lots of very tangible sources of growth and investment. They care about machines and wind turbines and all that sort of stuff. And it's very sector sort of focused. It's all this green, big sector stuff. And what we know is that however many times mayors try and make investment zones about advanced manufacturing, the fact of the matter is the urban part of our economy is not specialised and set up to deal with that sort of stuff. And frankly, a lot of our work shows that a lot of the innovation, a lot of the growth potential in the British economy lies outside those sectors. So there's lots of things on the service side, whether it's things like fintech and other bits and bobs, which our cities have advantages in that can be unlocked, and there are investments in relation to things like transport and devolution, which matter in helping that sort of along. Now, other than maybe a Tory commitment to gigabit internet and maybe some of the planning stuff, we don't really see anything that supports that sort of stuff in the longer term.
Yeah,
That's one thing.
yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, go on, carry on.
I was going to say the other bit, there's some other little bits of finance as well. Now, the other thing that I'm thinking about and is a little bit concerned about, and all these policy things, which is connected, which is because growth innovation has been molded into so many other things that you start to lose the focus on that particular issue. So, I mean, this is especially the case for Labour. There are big net zero commitments, net zero by 2030. But then there's a lot else that's been bolted onto that policy as time's gone on, even as the scope of the investment has been brought down. I'm not altogether clear, and I'm pretty sure the Labour front bench aren't altogether clear whether the green stuff is a levelling up policy, whether it's about cutting people's bills, or whether it is a net zero thing. So this morning, Jonathan Ashworth was on Today. All the usual buzzwords are sort of in there. Even though levelling up's not in the manifesto, as Anthony says, he's talking about being a world leader in green manufacturing and vehicles in particular. And the critical bit is when it comes to net zero and wind turbines and all that sort of stuff, he's saying, well, we're going to be manufacturing and not buying. Right. So if this was a net zero policy and you want to get to net zero as quickly as possible, you are buying.
You're buying, right?
Yeah, you are buying.
Yeah.
And you're hoping that the jobs that come out of that are in the assembly and the reconstruction. Now, that's fine. There's loads of great reasons why you might want to focus investment in this way. But the risk is if you're not buying off the shelf and you're trying to build an innovation ecosystem, it takes a lot longer. And there's a risk you end up doing neither very well. So for me, there are the big concerns that emerge in this space.
Yeah, I suppose, the point you made earlier on, which is the geography aspect, when you think about the geography of the green economy, as it were, on the one hand, we often talk about certain places that, will be able to capture more of the green activity, more of the green related jobs, particularly as they're related to energy production in some shape or form. But that geography is very, very similar to the geography of where we see very, very energy intensive industries that by definition are going to go through quite a radical and difficult challenge over the next period. So you both, on the one hand, you have an opportunity, which is a certain geography, but you also have a problem, which the geography is quite similar. And you might end up being in a sort of, a net position of very close to neutral over the period.
Especially with things like oil and gas in Aberdeen. So the SNP have been banging on about this in a great deal, but Labour's commitment to no new licenses is going to cost 100,000 jobs. Well, to me, the immediate thing is lots of these industries are quite well related, that you're going to end up replacing one set of jobs with another, as you say, and how that fits into things about commitments to steel, which is effectively just saving Paul Talbot. It's not a new cutting edge frontier thing, is still unclear.
Yeah, and again, you talked about it, very much weighted towards tangible investment in tangible things, whereas we increasingly know the work of Steve Westlake and others talks to us about our economy particularly being increasingly intangible and supporting investment into those sorts of activities, those kinds of industries, which there are elements of that in the manifestos, but probably not as much as we would ideally want.
That would be certainly my reflection.
Yeah, and interesting you said, all of them industrial strategy to varying degrees back in favour, which is not just a British issue. You see that in lots of OECD countries, industrial strategy making a bit of a revival. So be interesting to see where we get to on that. Okay, so and you started to talk a little bit about the housing thing. What's in the manifesto is useful, but what's around the manifesto has also been particularly useful. Just give us some reflections of where we think we are now, or on the debate in relation to housing numbers, but also then the issue of planning reform. Is it broadly on the right track? What are we worried about?
I think there's kind of a bit of a difference in opinion between Conservatives and the Labour on this issue. Partly, and you can see this in the manifestos, where the Conservatives are setting out some kind of, partly based on their experience in government, some kind of smaller, kind of slightly crunchier policies that would be looking to increase house building in some discrete places, whereas Labour's promises are kind of big picture, a bit woollier, maybe perhaps a little bit less likely to deliver concrete increases in house building as a result. So, for example, while Conservative manifestos are setting out, we're going to repeal the rules on nutrient neutrality. We're going to use a new infrastructure levy that's coming with the Levelling Up Act. We're going to renew the Affordable Homes Programme. That's all part of it, but I think there's also a bit more of a kind of an urban focus within how the Conservatives are talking about it. They want, again, a doubling down on the brownfield issue. They want to increase densities in inner London. They say that very explicitly. And they want to use development corporations in the big cities to drive increases in density too. Now, of course, part of that is from the mirror image, which is that the Conservatives really want to protect the green belt, right?
Yeah.
And they're very clear this is, these are two sides of the same coin, that the green belt will be absolutely protected and housing will be fine under them because they're building so much in brownfield land. Labour's has taken a quite different approach in that they're saying, they value the green belt, they say it's important, but they think it should be reviewed under certain places, starting with maybe ending with brownfield sites in their kind of what they've called their grey belt designation. I think one issue for Labour is that their sort of bigger picture proposals are in some ways quite cautious. So it's largely about returning things back to the way they were in 2018, or under New Labour, with the winding back the changes to the National Planning Policy Framework under Gove, bringing back house building targets, bringing back some kind of regional strategic planning mechanisms, bringing back new towns. A lot of these are quite familiar proposals that we've seen in the past. I think there's obviously then a bit of a gap between, again, just kind of the rhetoric and the public debate, and then the content of the manifestos, which is that if house building is going to be this load-bearing thing for Labour's economic strategy, where you're getting loads more construction jobs, far more ability to absorb investment, higher incomes high disposable incomes after housing costs, but you've got the same planning system pretty much, and you've got a similar housing target, there's a real kind of gap in that aspiration and rhetoric that I think is going to cause tensions if they do get into government.
Yeah, I mean, is it fair to summarise, where particularly where Labour are, is that they broadly hold the current system constant, or at least they take the current system roughly back to 18, as it were, and then they say, well, we'll just be a bit tougher, we'll make some tough decisions. And I think we are, not just that, but we are increasingly sceptical that the current system can actually give you the numbers that you actually need, and presumably they want.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you can see this a little bit in the rhetoric around new towns, they're saying like, we're going to use new towns to deliver a big increase in house building across the country. By definition, you're admitting that the rest of the planning system is quite restrictive. If you're taking these places that are going to opt out of the planning system, are going to have quite a different approach. But you're then also going to find the places as well, right? It's a non-trivial problem trying to locate places that can absorb a big increase in housing and investment. And the way it seems that Labour's talking about some of these issues is we're going to allow places to bid for new towns. We're going to allow places to come forward and ask to have a new town in their place. So councils are going to ask to have their planning powers taken away, and have a big increase in housing and service demands. Not sure if that's going to be a viable strategy to scale up housing. And I often hear people kind of say that our proposals to move towards more of a zoning-based system, yes, they'd be very difficult. It's too big. It's too much of a political fight. But as you're saying, kind of, if Labour wants to have a strategy which is based around being tougher on targets, that means they have to be tough on targets every single day in government. to get house building even close to what they want their current system, what they want their aspirations to achieve. A move towards more of a zoning system would be more of a kind of set and forget system in which it's more rules based, it's more certain, and it wouldn't require as much pressure to function.
Yeah, and I think you've said before, but having the sort of dual track almost of doing some of this, this foundational system orientated type activities, as well as then pushing hard with the existing policy that you've got, the framework that you've got, and actually making it work, which does actually mean that you have to be a little bit tougher with places about actually making sure that the existing system is actually operationalized.
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's short-term wins you need to get through the system quite early to get the system back on its feet. But especially if you're thinking about, you know, two-term governments, which, you know, some people in Labour are saying, I think you need to be doing a bit more than, you know, short-term tweaks to get big improvement to housing outcomes.
Yeah, quite well. We've got a couple of questions on housing market renewal, whether we think we're going to get that, which is obviously a slightly different program from back in the day, but also just touched on, which is the period, how long do you think it takes to get into the housing agenda and actually see some of the numbers that you want to see? I mean, the obvious slightly trite response is the sooner you start, the sooner you see the numbers, the longer you wait to see any numbers. And it's one of those things that you can see quite quickly as to the pipeline and how it's responded. So we can come back to that as well. Caitlin, take us to the transport theme again, and just talk a little bit about reflections on what we've heard, good, bad, and the indifferent.
Yeah, so I think I'll just give a wee bit of context to start, which is that obviously the reason that we care about transport-centric cities and that the parties, I think, should be, I think we would say, thinking about transport fairly seriously is because transport does matter to that bigger economic growth question. So our Measuring Up report from 2021 shows that improving our public transport connectivity to the same level as European cities would contribute about 23.1 billion in productivity gains to the national economy. And those productivity gains mostly come from those underperforming cities that James talked about. And I think broadly across all of the transport areas, including ones that I haven't really talked about, the parties aren't really thinking about that role that transport is playing in the national economy, particularly in cities. So I think that's an important bit of context. And the other important bit of context we have is that ridership in the UK is low and declining. This isn't just a post-COVID thing. It's been in decline for decades. And it's also declining from a low baseline. You just don't get the same level of public transport users, ridership and users in the UK as you do in European cities. And that's not just because people prefer their car, that's because, and we've done lots of work in this, again, measuring up in our gear shift reports, we just have poor accessibility. You have far fewer people who can easily get to a city centre in 30 minutes than you do in European cities. So again, returning to those two issues that matter most for cities, that's buses and cars, it is good to see a little bit of focus on the manifestos, but I think what we would say is they're lacking a bit of nuance. And the first area of that obviously is around the franchising promises. We know that franchising is a really positive thing and that it can work, and we kind of welcome that recognition. But there's a little bit of cause for concern, especially when you look at the Labour manifesto in the approach to franchising. So we know that buses, however they're run, work best when you have dense urban areas where services are viable, you have more people living near a bus stop, and also where you're operating at the right geographic level. So that means transport operator, a combined authority who can really look at how the network works and integrates with other modes across the whole economic geography of the city. And if you create a situation where anywhere that wants to can franchise, what you risk is having lots of smaller networks where you're either running kind of more rural routes that are much less economically viable at huge cost to the public purse, or you risk having lots of kind of piecemeal operators who aren't able to really effectively integrate. And the other thing, I think more obviously, is that none of the talk around franchising is backed up with funding. When you do have councils under pressure in that situation, you are going to need national commitments to funding. I think the second area on buses where they're lacking a bit of nuance is the fare cap. And this is because, obviously it's very headline grabbing policy. I completely understand why they would choose to put it in there, but it's also a very short-term policy. And it's not an effective approach if the goal is to get more people using public transport, if the goal is to contribute to some of those big chunky net zero targets that are also in the manifestos. And that's because, and I don't think you actually need me to tell you, if the bus doesn't exist, doesn't matter if it's £0, £2 or £10, people aren't going to use it. And even if you do have the services in place, what you might achieve, and this probably isn't the goal when you have a fare cap, is a short-term jump for the duration of that cap, followed by people going back to whichever mode is most convenient. And that's what we know from the kind of discount tickets that places like Germany and Spain ran over last summer. And then add to that the fact that it's costly policy, and it's very hard for any party to back out of once they've implemented. I would be fairly cautious about commitments to that in a manifesto. And then just turning to cars.
Yep.
Again, I think what we would welcome here is a bit more thought about how to shift people on public transport, and of course the role that cars play in that. And this is where it really starts to come apart, particularly when we look at the Conservative manifesto. They are committing to a blanket ban on road pricing. That just leaves them with a huge question mark over how they're going to replace decreasing revenue from road tax and fuel duty. That's £35 billion a year. And neither of the other parties talk about how they'd address this shortfall either. So you've got pressure on local authorities, you've got a real need to fund public transport improvements, and you've got all three of them talking about increasing EV uptake. So that road pricing question, that replacement of revenue, is going to be a major issue that they cannot avoid. And secondly, again, specifically in the Conservative manifesto, you have a bit of a broader concern about how they're viewing devolution, which is something they're also talking about in the same for Labour.
Yeah.
So they are talking about banning local places from introducing some of those congestion charges, things like that. And this kind of intervention is going to undermine a lot of the progress that the Conservatives have made on DEVO over the last few governments. And it's particularly worrying when you look at those interventions that are going to help local authorities to raise that revenue that would fund public transport. So they'd be creating a real vicious circle in doing this. And I think for many of the parties, when there's that real need for upfront funding for big pieces like franchising, they absolutely cannot be doing things that make it harder for local places to do these things and to raise the revenue that will fund them.
Yeah, that's a great summary and of where we are on some of those issues. As I say, we should be definitely alive to this real worry about unfunded mandates, right? Giving powers or capabilities to do things, all of which we know will require investment, just hard money going in, never mind investment into building up the capacity in order to do it. It's the same with, as you say, on franchising or municipal ownership. Whether you're for it or against it ideologically doesn't matter. If you're going to give that power out to make it meaningful, it has to be accompanied with investment. So unfunded mandates, I think, is a problem, not least because of particularly the state of local government funding. And then, as I said, it's a classic central government approach to devolution, which is you can have devolution and autonomy, providing you do exactly what we ideally want you to do. I'm pretty convinced that's not just a Conservative view, it's a Labour view as well, and we will see this issue come up where over time, if for example the mayors have a different view to Labour and start to want to do things that maybe the Labour government doesn't particularly want them to do, those tensions will inevitably grow. So it's a kind of great insight into the underpinnings of devolution and the extent to which governments of various persuasions adhere to it as well. We'll come back to some of the questions, but Anne, just take up the devolution local government perspective in relation to what we think about it, goods, bads, and indifferent.
Yeah, I mean, I think again what's interesting between the two manifestos is that in terms of the commitments set out, there aren't that many differences. They both want to see widening and deepening of devolution. Probably the biggest difference in terms of policy that's set out is that Labour have said they want to introduce new primary legislation in this area, although they don't really specify what that difference will be. However, I think there's a strange kind of shared similarity between the two manifestos on their attitudes towards devolution and local government, partly kind of building what Caitlin has said. And I think the Conservative mayor, I'd look for the Conservative manifesto looking for mayors. I think I'm right in saying the Conservative manifesto exclusively refers to mayors insofar as they're either criticising them for doing bad things or they want to ban mayors from doing things. So it's like stop having night SARS, like stop having road pricing, etc. You've also got a kind of a commitment in the Conservative manifesto to ban local government from having 4-day work weeks, for their internal arrangements. And I think this really points to, specifically for the Conservatives, a problem they have in having real difficulties around articulating a vision for what is local government for, right? What is the purpose of devolution and local services and local funding? And, you know, however the election goes for them, I think they're going to have a serious think over the next, period in Parliament about, you know, going back to basics of what is local government for and how should it work and how should it be funded and what are the rights and responsibilities of local government and where should central government kind of back off. I think from Labour's side, superficially, I mean, well, not superficially, I think there is more of a difference in terms of language around using partnership, around working with local authorities, but it's often quite national in nature. So it's about kind of working with the mayors and the devolved governments, having kind of a council of nations and regions. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I think it's part of how you need to understand the devolution process. But one thing that it's missing, along with the Conservative manifesto, is this role of the big cities and of big city economies. You know, Manchester, Birmingham, London, Leeds, Glasgow, these places don't really come up as distinct places in their own right and as local economies in their own right. And, you know, whichever party gets into government, I think they're going to have a serious think about, you know, just to govern well, they're going to have to think about these places as independent local economies that need their own, have their own agendas, need to grow and be successful in their own terms, rather than just being part of the sum of the national economy.
Yeah, and you picked up on that in terms of from an economy perspective as well, James, that, you know, there wasn't a sort of an appreciation of the different nature of different places across the country, but also the different roles that places, you know, do and should be playing in the economy as well.
And it's politically difficult. That's the other thing to sort of draw out of this whole discussion, which is, okay, if the underperformance lies in our big cities, whether it's on innovation, investment, transport, whatever, that means putting a lot of effort into certain parts of the economy more than others. And the Conservatives in particular have been very vulnerable on this sort of stuff of late. You know, Rishi Sunak talks a lot about towns, lots of town money going everywhere, lots of nice to haves rather than things that are really going to improve productive potential. I don't think that's a problem that's going to go away even when the government changes.
And do you think there's something in there? You know, you talked a little bit about, you know, the manufacturing sort of led type ideas. You know, interesting question about if you think about the sort of expansion of those things to the extent that that is possible, you very quickly get into a land availability question. And where is that land available? It's typically, obviously, not in our cities, or at the very least, it's on the very edges of cities. It'll be in places in between or some of our smaller towns, which typically have more land availability. Do you think that, you know, is that part of it in thinking about marrying the economic offer to the political offer or to the political response?
Oh yeah, I think it is hugely important, and this is where all the planning stuff and everything falls into place. As you say, a lot of these sort of advanced manufacturing units and all the rest of it need a lot of space. Now, it may very well be that the actual innovation side, which is the bit that you want for driving productivity in future, will be occurring in cities, whereas assembly and production is occurring elsewhere. You do see that in other parts of the world, but we also saw a little bit of that in our hotspots report we did over 1.5 years ago. Cities are playing this role where they're sort of generating ideas, getting all the techie people with all the coding in place, where assembly is happening everywhere else. But then there's a jobs question that's attached to that, which is something I'll talk about a little bit further in this conversation. But I think there is a question about what kind of jobs are going where, and I'm not sure that this lack of interest in space is really going to help you solve those problems.
Yes, and I guess in some respects, Caitlin, it's a similar story when you were talking about, for example, the franchising. You know, you set out some of the conditions that give us the best chance of getting franchising to be successful. You know, big areas where you've got lots of potential passengers, but you've also got a density offer. But, you know, in a sense, you can try to create franchise bus systems that give us the best chance. That's quite a different challenge of providing bus services in, say, deep rural areas where there aren't many people. So again, a sort of lack of engagement with the idea of how places vary and what they actually need. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think it's the same story, and it's the same, I think, from all of the manifestos. There's a bit of a lack of recognition that we've just talked about, and you could essentially replace the word manufacturing or house building with buses in this case, where they're not thinking about the role that big cities will have to play. And I think they're also not setting themselves up for success because the networks are more viable in those dense places, and because it would contribute so much in those productivity gains. There needs, and I think I understand that it's a hard thing to do politically, but there needs to be a little bit of thinking about where they are going to prioritize. And it would have been really great to see some specific mentions of, I mean, we've done work, for example, looking at Glasgow, that looks if you increase the bus frequency to say 4 times an hour, I can't remember quite off the top of my head, but I think it's something around a maximum of 300,000 additional people using the network. They can do things like that. And I think looking at places like that, where, you know, a bit of really targeted investment in franchising would have a fairly big impact, and looking at that low-hanging fruit would be good to see. And again, when you have like a very constrained funding environment, I think that recognition of prioritization is also necessary there, because we will not be able to franchise everywhere. It has huge upfront costs, or it would take a very long time to do so. So thinking about where it would be best to do it first and where we can learn from would be welcome.
I think that's a great point. I mean, come in and saying that, you know, I suppose it's a similar question or issue on the devolution, filling in the, you know, the missing 50%. I suppose there's a bit of a worry that, in a sense, if you make this available, make whatever it is an aspiration for everywhere, that actually prevents you from making reasonable progress in somewhere, because suddenly, you know, you're constrained by the fact that everywhere needs it or wants it or expects it, and actually making prioritization and moving hard yards in some places all the more difficult.
Yeah, and that's downstream of centralisation, right?
Yeah.
You know, the British state is so centralised, both in terms of powers, but also in terms of funding.
Yeah.
To get anything done, the public sector to play its role as steward of the national economy and of all local economies, it's the centre that has to go around picking places, even though there's this very clear political imperative that it's hard for parties to choose one place and then not choose another. But this is the case for devolution, right? So is that we need to have, you know, to resolve this problem, we need a tier of local government that fights for their own local economies, which is always thinking about how do we squeeze a little bit more productivity out, how do we get more jobs in, how do we get investment in, and then central government can worry about, well, what are the big things affecting the national economy, and how do we get, you know, how do we set up a framework that allows, you know, our expanding local economies to expand in a way that is good for the entire national economy. But that's kind of where the devolution, you know, conversation should be and should be trying to get us to, but we're not seeing that, I think, currently in the manifestos.
Yeah, that's a great point. Right, let's go to part 3, as it were. So the manifestos are what they are, and obviously we wouldn't expect all of the detail, all of the nuance that we've been talking about to be expressed in the manifestos. We want to see a bit more nuance than we've seen, but we, you know, we recognise that a lot of that comes for the next government. So James, you kick us off. So thinking now about the next government, what is it that we would be saying? What bits of the manifesto we want to kind of roll forward and make sure that they're not lost, but also what would we be saying to the next government in that sort of innovation, investment, growth space?
Well, the first thing to say is something that we said over and over again throughout this conversation, which is addressing existing problems, i.e. the big cities, is going to be the single thing that unlocks all these other things. And there are levers on transport and planning and devolution, which are going to make that possible or not. Fiscal devolution is part of that. Anthony mentioned it before. There's something that's there that will help drive productivity, and I think it is important. And then thinking about where do things like innovation policy and, you know, redistribution and regional inequality fit within that conversation. I think that's a big thing that they're going to have to think about. And for me, part of the answer to that is, well, you need to double down on what we have, where there are strengths, and recognise that if you are going to do something different, that it's costly, it will take a long time to reap any sort of benefits from it, and that whether we like it or not, there's going to be a trade-off between output and jobs and things like that going into the future. I mean, a great example of this is in the US. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been thrown at the CHIPS and the Inflation Reduction Act to boost the American innovation ecosystem. And that's great. There are lots of strategic reasons why you might do that. But as yet, we've yet to see any impact on jobs and output. We probably will in the near future, but the sorts of money that are on the table, the sums that are on the table from both the Conservatives and Labour are nowhere near that area. So if you are going to be doing things that are different, it's really important to get that right, because we do have financing problems. R&D has been ramping up in the last couple of years, but we've got a long way to go. You know, we see that some of our most innovative big companies You know, they might pop up in Manchester or whatever else, but where do they go to raise capital? They go to the US. It's not as if there's a north-south story. In the British case, they just go over abroad. And that attaches things like, you know, in Cambridge, there's lots of planning restrictions allowing Cambridge to grow is going to be really important. Things like that are all going to play a role in unlocking that sort of stuff. The second reflection will be things on picking sectors and this sort of tangible focus we've touched on a lot of the time. As I say, there are good reasons for this. As we should do net zero because it's a good in its own right. We should invest in things like steel because it's a sovereign capability that the British state wants to have, regardless of the cost. And shipbuilding is quite similar in that sense. But you've got to be realistic about which things are going to be driving productivity in future. And the fact of the matter is, we're in a service-based economy. Our comparative advantage is in services. We see this both in our sort of balance of trade, but also just important generally. That means getting that right means focusing on cities, worrying a lot less about picking specific sectoral winners, because in this sort of sphere, there's a lot of cross-pollinization. These things do well when they're near other innovative things, and then near well-educated people, and then we have the transport connections to sort of deliver it. But again, that gets into these conversations about being honest about what you can do, which bits the centre picks to move things along. That's all the difficult side. Whether Rachel Reeves is going to come forward with more money to make all this sort of stuff happen is, of course, doesn't seem especially likely, and the Conservatives seem to show absolutely no interest in pouring more money into this sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it's going to be difficult. So, but I think for us, focusing on the big cities, unlocking that thing is really going to be the low-hanging fruit, to use the jargon.
Yeah. Okay. And give us the thoughts on next government and housing.
Yes, I think the way we conceive of it is there's sort of we have two-track strategy. So, what are the small R planning reforms within the current planning system to get it working a bit better, and what are sort of the big R planning reforms to create a new planning system that would permanently improve house building over time. Certainly in terms of the small R, I think a lot of it is kind of currently already in the manifesto that kind of Labour have set out, that both parties have set out. So obviously the Conservatives had their focus on increasing density within the big cities, using development corporations to to improve house building in and near cities, not just Leeds, but also places like Cambridge. Nutrient neutrality, getting rid of exceptionally poor policy in terms of the cost-benefit ratio there, but also kind of on the Labour side, reversing some of the quite damaging changes to the NPPF, to kind of bring back house building targets. I think it's quite important within the short term for getting house building back on track. There's also a few other things that the manifestos haven't mentioned, so things like the National Development Management Policies, which the Levelling Up Act has introduced. They're going to be really important, and in the next government, and we'd encourage the next government to take quite an expansive view of what should fall into those. But over the longer term, we think that if you're serious about housing and planning reform playing a load-bearing role in your economic strategy, you have to go further than just these small tweaks and small changes.
Yeah.
So we think moving towards a more flexible zoning system, like we see in other G7 and other OECD countries, is really the key step that needs to happen to do this. This will allow you to integrate local plans with local transport plans, so you could plan for infrastructure and housing at the same time. But I think you mentioned earlier how there's questions about kind of how quickly this stuff would come into place. We do know from places like New Zealand, which have done kind of similar upscaled planning reforms, that the impacts on rents and house prices are pretty much immediate. Like within 5 years, you're already seeing like noticeably lower rents and much slower house price growth as a result of these changes. But also, think about that as well in terms of the big changes to the green belt as well. I think is essential for any government that's serious about improving housing outcomes across the country.
Yeah, and again, on those sorts of issues, you say progress can be made almost immediately through some of those reforms. Some of the bigger reforms will take a bit of time, but the longer we leave it to start the process, the longer it is before the benefits of those reforms come into being. And ideally, you'd want to be able to see some of the fruits of that, same way as James was saying on the economy, in the first parliament, right? I mean, that's part and parcel of the first parliament, is to lay down what's been achieved or what's already underway, which gives you a much stronger mandate when you go seeking a second term, which particularly the Labour leadership have talked about. Okay, Caitlin, give us the recommendations, suggestions on the transport front.
Yeah, so I think I already touched on a bit of the prioritization and thinking around big cities that we'd like to see, just the same as James talked about, and that goes for the role of transport in economic growth. It goes for the role of transport in making some of those net zero cities, most of net zero reductions, because most of those are also going to come from cities. And it also goes for politically speaking, if the parties do want another term, they would want to see presumably those transport improvements coming through quickly within that first term, and that's going to be easier to achieve in cities where you have those viable networks. And then just to make 3 quick kind of reflections and recommendations for the next government other than that, I think what I would like to see is a little bit more of that joining of the dots between the role of public transport, so buses I've talked a lot about, and the role of cars. Like I've said, you cannot have modal shift, reduction in private car use, improvement of public transport, and increased ridership without thinking a little bit more about how you make that the more convenient option against the car. And that could be a whole range of policies, but I think we didn't see any thinking about how those relate to each other in the manifestos. And I think the second reflection that I would have for the new government would be a real focus on the need to enable places to make the right choice for them. We do see a bit of this around the franchising, around the powers on local rail stations, and that's a really positive sign. But obviously, the much more concerning sign is some of the rhetoric around intervening with the decisions that mayors would be making, the bans or the case-by-case decision making, for example, from the Conservatives on low traffic neighbourhoods. So what it would, I think I would want to see is the powers for places to make the right choice for them. And in some cases, that is going to involve revenue raising powers, and it is going to involve measures against car usage or to disincentivize car usage. And the other thing I think on that is would welcome more of the consistent long-term funding for local places. So that would be, and this applies to whichever party forms the next government, continuation of the city region sustainable transport settlements. We'd like to see that continued and ideally enhanced. And I think the third reflection is the elephant in the room. They are going to have to think about road pricing. That goes for any party, including the Conservatives, who have said they've committed to not doing it. But I think I would recommend that they view it as an opportunity to create a system that makes for a smooth shift away to replace that 35 billion of lost revenue, and really looks at how new revenue, whatever new system does come into place, road pricing or another thing they may be thinking about, can really help support that modal shift and that net zero targets, the economic growth piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, that's a great point. Inevitability, tax revenue and the shortfall, particularly when the next government of whatever persuasion will be in desperate need of tax revenues in order to do some of the stuff, if not all of the stuff that it wants to do. So you finish us off on the devolution sort of local government set of recommendations or suggestions.
Yeah, so I think kind of the key thing that we've been looking out for is to what extent is the government going to be deepening devolution in the places that already have it. Not to say kind of widening devolution out to places that are now open to it isn't something the government shouldn't be considering. But I think it's trying to spend a lot of capital on getting devolution out to places that fundamentally don't want it and that don't play the same role in the national economy that the big cities do. Risks wasting a lot of fiscal capital for not much economic return. There is potentially scope for like deepening and widening at the same time with a full-scale reorganization of local governments. But surprise, surprise, that's not in the manifestos either. I think on local finance, I think again it's disappointing that the Conservative manifesto ruled out kind of any significant changes to council tax, which is a bit odd in one way, right? Sort of Conservative government ruling out tax cuts for the least popular tax in the country is a bit strange. And obviously there's been a bit of conversation today about whether Labour would possibly attach this. I think the really big story on the Labour side with regards to local finance isn't so much council tax, where we've done quite a bit of work showing that majority of people in every part of the country could get council tax cuts if you did a fiscal devolution, but rather a promise Labour made several years ago, which then disappeared and now sort of re-emerged like a submarine, is the proposal to replace business rates with some new system.
Yeah.
Now, if this is, it's complicated and hard, if this becomes a proposal where it's, primarily about saving the high street and, taxing those greedy online retailers, it's a dead end, I think, pretty much, would be our conclusion. If that becomes kind of the basis for thinking a bit more about how local finance can work, not just in a we need to rescue these councils kind of way, but in a framework for thinking how do we improve the growth incentives of local government so that councils are rewarded rather than being penalised for growing their local economies. I think that could be quite an interesting part of of reforms to local finance, and any kind of moves in towards fiscal devolution that would take us in that more pro-growth direction, I think, are the things that we'd be looking to see in the next government.
Yeah, excellent. So we'll come to a close. I hope you found that useful. And as I said, lots of analysis done on the manifestos. We've tried to do it from a urban policy perspective and tried to give some nuance into those sorts of things and some of the themes that matter. I think always, in a sense, of where we are on the agenda is the balance between trying to get stuff done immediately and to show returns and progress, whilst also recognising, as we all do when we think about how government works or how the state works, is that there needs to be a parallel process of reform and adjustment. And as part of that, it's not just about how central government works, which we've heard a lot about in terms of missions, etc., from various parties, but actually the relationship between the local state and the national state is widely out of kilter relative to other countries, and we're going to need to do something about that. That's not necessarily the stuff that people on the doorstep care deeply about, but if we want to make progress on some of those fundamental issues that people do care about and has contributed to underperformance in the country for the last decade and a half, we are going to need to grapple with some of those sorts of issues as well, actually how the local state works and the incentives that it faces to do some of the things to grow the economy at the local level and national. So plenty for the next government to get underway once we've got through the election process. So thank you all for joining us today. Hope you found that useful. Until the next time, take care and stay safe. Bye for now.